When going to arcades, most people usually gravitate towards the games that get you tickets to buy overpriced cheap garbage that's going to break as soon as you bring it back home, or, of course, good times with friends. But at almost every single arcade, there are these weird video games that 8 times out of 10 they have tacky plastic toy guns. The games always require you to shoot an armada of enemies while you're just standing/sitting in the uncomfortable bench while the camera moves around the game world. After some searching for these types of games out of curiosity, I learned that they had a special name, and that they have a deep, untold story. This is the history of rail shooters. Now before we talk about rail shooters, we need to talk about shooter games and light gun games. The definition of what a rail shooter and what a light gun shooter is. Essentially, a rail shooter is a type of action-based video game where the player controls limited to pointing a gun at the screen. They are not able to control the path, but in some cases the camera pauses in areas where you need to kill enemies. The reason as to why they're called rail shooters is because the gameplay is a lot like you're on rails, like how a roller coaster runs over a predefined set of tracks. The camera/player/you does the same in the game. A light gun shooter is a shooter video game genre where the design element is to aim and shoot with a gun-shaped controller. The very first light gun was made in 1934 by Charles W. Griffith, and then patented in 1935. The gun had a light bulb that would activate whenever the trigger was pulled. It was originally meant for marksmanship in shooting galleries. The very first light gun game was called Rayo-Light and was released in 1936 by Seeburg, which used Charles's patent. The game had you shooting a duck in a wooden veneer cabinet against a painted background. The duck had a light sensing tube that would cause the duck to drop whenever you shot it with the light rifle. The rifle would create a beam of light whenever the user would pull the trigger. It sold for $400 and paved the way for similar games in the future. In 1939, Seeburg released Chicken Sam, and a few other games that were released were war-themed until after the war. Seeburg released Shoot the Bear in 1947 up until 1949. Due to its success, Seeburg were able to sell a lot of these units, and consistently for 2 years.
I'm talking about cold hard flipping cash.
The game was far more complex compared to the previous two, as the bear would growl and run around the track and even get on its hind legs. The game would also record your hits, and a sound would play whenever you would pull the trigger of the rifle. In 1954, Seeburg released Raccoon Hunt, and it had the raccoon hide/dodge behind the trees. The game counted how good you were with how many times you were able to hit the raccoon with the 20 bullets given. Getting 12 points would give you the marksman rating, 16 would give you the sharpshooter rating, and 19 or 20 perfect hits would give you the expert rating. Seeburg originally produced orchestrions in 1907, and orchestrion is like an umbrella term for a machine that plays music. And the founder of Seeburg, J.P. Seeburg, kept selling them until 1927 when he started manufacturing new coin-operated phonographs. In 1928, they were one of the first manufacturers of the multi-select jukebox that they released and called it the Audiophone. They kept making jukeboxes and ended up putting other jukebox companies out of business because they made an extremely reliable mechanism that allowed to play both sides of 50 different records. They dominated the market until the 1970s due to the changing demand until, unfortunately, they went out of business in 1979. Going back to the 1950s, arcades preferred smaller and more alternative gun games that didn't take up as much space as the Seeburg light games did, because Seeburg originally wanted to make their light gun games to show the whole family how to safely shoot, and were much easier than going to actual gun ranges. For more information on light guns, check out this video by the Gaming Historian about the ultimate guide to NES light guns. Or open that video in another tab and finish watching this video. At the same time, I would really appreciate it if you would like, subscribe, and check out my links in the description. If you wanted to support me directly, you can do so at my Patreon. Anyway, back to the content at hand. The very first shooter game was released in April of 1962, and it was called Space War, and it was developed by Steve Russell in collaboration with several other people. The game had each person control one of two spaceships called the Needle and the Wedge. You would have to shoot one another before the gravitational pull of the star in the middle kills either both of you or one of you. Fast forward to 1973, where a small group of high school students named Steve Colley, Greg Thompson, and Howard Palmer began developing the world's first 3D multiplayer first-person shooter called Maze. It was then developed further and expanded in 1974 and was renamed to Maze War. However, the creators constantly call it by both names. The gameplay had players traversing a flat maze with you shooting opponents in order to score points. You were able to move forwards and backwards, turn left and right, as well as looking behind. Amazingly, you were also able to peek around corners. Basically, same logic and mechanics as modern first-person shooters, but really futuristic for the time because you could also see names along with sending messages. I really hope that chats back then weren't as toxic as they are now. It was extremely revolutionary at the time and quite literally shaped the world of FPS games. The earliest known and possibly very first rail shooter that I found was Starhawk, released in 1979 by Cinematronics. It was programmed and designed by Tim Skelly, who had vector arcade-styled graphics and was inspired by the Star Wars Episode 4 Trench Run. This was also one of the first arcade games to use concepts from Star Wars. The gameplay required you to shoot ships before they destroyed your ship. You were given 60 seconds, but could be given an extra 20 each time you get 10,000 points. The game gets more difficult and sends you more enemies as it goes on. What's funny is that because this was early arcade years, the arcade cabinet was so top heavy that employees had to put a cinder block inside of it so that it wouldn't tip over onto people. This game could also technically be the very first bootleg, due to the fact that the company didn't ask to use the Star Wars license, but Cinematronics ended up going out of business and was acquired by Tradewest, until Tradewest was bought out by WMS, so realistically they never really had to pay for any copyright infringement. In the 1980s, arcades were becoming much more popular for avid gamers to flock to in order to spend their quarters on the latest and coolest game that they could find. One of these games was Atari's Battlezone, released in 1980 for arcades and the Atari 2600. Designed and programmed by Ed Rotberg, who was inspired by Atari's previously released shooter called Tank, released in 1974 and was a top-down shooter for two players to fight against each other. Battlezone had you controlling a tank that was attacked by other tanks and missiles. You would have to use a radar scanner in order to locate enemies in a 3D graphical world that had a flat pane, mountainous horizon that featured a volcano, a crescent moon, and additional sprites to add substance to the game world. This game technically isn't a rail shooter because you can move yourself around with a bit more freedom, but it is another very early game in the FPS genre. In 1983, Mike Halley designed Star Wars, which was released by Atari and ended up selling over 12,000 arcade units. The gameplay for Star Wars had you play as Luke Skywalker and was divided into 3 phases. The first phase had you engage in a dogfight with Darth Vader and other TIE fighters. The second phase had you fly across the surface of the Death Star whilst being attacked by artillery bunkers. In the final and third phase, you had to navigate the trench and, like in the movie, fire a direct hit onto the exhaust port target. The Death Star explodes. Development for the game began in 1981, where it was called Warp Speed and was originally worked on by Ed Rotberg from the development of Battlezone before. However, he left Atari in late 1981 and Atari got the licenses from Lucasfilm, and they finished the development and released it as Star Wars. This game has also been included on Greatest Video Games of All Time lists. In the same year of 1983, Sega released Astron Belt for arcades, as well as it being the very first major arcade laserdisc video game. Developed in 1982, it had full motion video and was a third-person space combat rail shooter. The gameplay had you control single spacecraft and shoot at vast amounts of enemies in a series of waves. At the start of the game, you have an unlimited set of lives until your timer runs out, which was typically 60 seconds. When the 60 seconds were up, you would be given a limited number of lives. If you lost all of them, then the game ends. It was very well received and topped multiple charts, and was praised for having realistic background visuals, for the time of course. It was also quite revolutionary at the time for having the good visuals and audio, a continue feature, the cockpit cabinet, and a vibrating seat. A year later, Broderbund published a 3D rail shooter called Stealth, which was designed by Tracy Legrone and Richard Sansum, and published for the Atari 8-bit and Commodore 64. The game has you piloting a fighter plane in order to get into enemy territory, and travel a distance of 10,000 miles in order to destroy the Black Tower. At the same time, you need to monitor your fuel supply as well as shooting enemies and dodging obstacles. The game has 5 levels and ramps up in difficulty. It had a decent reception, with some people praising the game for its graphics and gameplay, whereas others felt the opposite, saying that stealth denies you fine playability. In April of 1984, Nintendo released Duck Hunt for arcades in the NES. Directed and designed by Shigeru Miyamoto, the game uses an NES Zapper gun controller in order to shoot ducks that appear on screen for points. It was sold with it being included with the purchase of an NES.
At everyone's attention.
As it's no competition, Nintendo home entertainment games are blowing other items out of the water.
The Nintendo Entertainment System was first released in the US October 8th.
The game was received very positively, becoming popular in arcades and sold over 28 million copies in 1985. It also went on to inspire future games with similar mechanics and appeared in the 2015 movie Pixels. There was even a horror game called Duck Season. In the October of 1985, another game by Sega was released called Space Harrier. It is a third-person rail shooter arcade game that is set in a surreal world with a frozen landscape and a checkerboard-like ground. There are 18 stages, and the final stage is a boss rush that include the bosses from the previous stages. It was also one of the first arcade games to use 16-bit graphics and a superscalar technology that would scale sprites at very high frame rates. The development story for this game is actually extremely interesting. A Sega designer named Ida wrote a 100-page document proposing the idea for a 3D shooter with the name Harrier in the title. During development, another developer named Yu Suzuki simplified the majority of the game by changing the title character to a human, which allowed for more resources so that the game could look more realistic. They also rewrote the entire proposal, making the game more sci-fi, but the only thing they took from the 100 pages was the Harrier name. The inspirations for a newer game design was from the movie The Neverending Story, released in 1984, and an anime series released in 1982 called Space Cobra. The game's enemies were also inspired by the anime Gundam. Suzuki included an Easter egg in the game with an enemy named Ida, who is a large moai-looking floating stone head, and the reason why he chose this was because the designer had a really big head. Yu Suzuki designed the arcade cabinets and made 3 different designs for the game. The standard upright one, a version with a fixed seat, and another one was a cockpit-styled rolling cabinet that would move based on which direction you would move the joystick. These types of cabinets are known as Taikon cabinets, or Taikon games, which translated roughly to bodily sensation or experience games. This term was coined by Sega during the 1980s. Sega weren't sure with these designs due to how much they cost to build them, but Suzuki insisted and even went as far as to offer his own salary if the game failed. However, he didn't have to do this because the game was a major hit. Space Harrier was praised for its audio, visuals, and gameplay features. Unfortunately, after the game's release, Suzuki had little to no involvement with Space Harrier's future, with him being absent in the next 2 installments, that being Space Harrier 2 and Space Harrier 3D. In 1986, a game developer named Cascade released Skyrunner for MS-DOS, the Commodore 64, and ZX Spectrum. It is a third-person rail shooter where you pilot an aircraft called a skimmer in order to shoot and destroy enemy towers. After destroying most of the towers, the skimmer drops down and then has you controlling a skybike, which you use to destroy other enemies' skybikes. You need to avoid different obstacles in both of these sections. After defeating the boss, the gameplay loops back to controlling the skimmer. The game is set in the 24th century, where a drug called Sky is harvested on the planet of Malak, with harvesting machines defended by skybikers and defense towers. A few months later, Tatsumi developed and released Lock On, which is a futuristic first-person combat flight simulator. The game has 20 levels and has you follow a predefined path, a rail shooter. However, you're able to steer yourself to avoid missiles, and you can fire guns in your own missiles, but as the name of the game suggests, you need to lock onto enemies. In the summer of 1987, Sega developed and released Afterburner, which is a third-person vehicular combat arcade game. There are 18 unique stages where you are in control of an F-14 Tomcat fighter jet, destroying enemies using a machine gun and heat-seeking missiles. Afterburner was designed by Yu Suzuki in the Sega AM2 division. In interviews, this game was intended to be Sega's blockbuster game. Development began in December 1986 and was a very well-kept guarded secret in the company. The game was inspired by Top Gun and Laputa Castle in the Sky, both being released in 1986. He originally wanted the game to have a steampunk aesthetic similar to the one in Laputa, but chose to have visuals reminiscent of Top Gun as it would be approachable by worldwide audiences. It ended up being a worldwide commercial success and was one of the top 5 highest grossing arcade games of 1988. As well as it being released in arcades, it was also on the Sega Master System, Amiga, Atari ST, Commodore 64, MS-DOS, NES, and the ZX Spectrum. Like Space Harrier, it had different arcade cabinets. However, Afterburner only had 2, the first being the standard upright cabinet and the second being a Tycon arcade cabinet. The deluxe cabinet appears in Terminator 2 while John Connor is playing it, as the T-1000 looks for him. The sequel was released in the same year as the first and had slightly better controls and movement. A few months later, Zaxxon 3D was released in November by Sega for the Master System console. It was based on the earlier installment released in 1981 titled Zaxxon, which was an isometric shooter. In Zaxxon 3D, you're required to pilot a Zaxxon craft through 9 levels of the Vargon Space Fortress using the Sega Scope 3D glasses connected to the game system. That sentence alone is enough to cause a medieval peasant to implode. The reception for this game was fairly positive and was praised for its visuals. In 1989, Subway Software designed Roller Coaster Rumbler, which was published by Tynesoft. Roller Coaster Rumbler is a rail shooter video game released for the Amiga, Atari ST, Commodore 64, and MS-DOS. It is in a first-person perspective and has you sitting in the front seat of a roller coaster. You're equipped with a mounted machine gun, and you have to fire at targets that pop up during the course of the ride. One of the most influential shooters, Wolfenstein 3D, was released in May of 1992. It was developed by id Software and programmed by John Carmack and Romero. The gameplay was sectioned off by levels with a different number of enemies in each level. It used a form of raycasting rendering, which helped determine the gameplay engine as well as the player's field of view. Since everyone knows what Wolfenstein is, I'm not going to say much about the story or what happens in the game besides the fact that you shoot Nazis. The development for Wolfenstein 3D began in December of 1991, where both Jones were working on different aspects of the game, Romero on the story and Carmack on the programming. The levels were designed in 2D using a program called TED, which stood for Tile Editor. When the game was close to being finished, there were concerns over the amounts of violence, to which id Software responded with more gruesome imagery such as bloody walls, corpses, skeletons, as well as recording cries and screams in German. The game was released, and in the summer they began development on a different game called Spear of Destiny. However, John Carmack started work on a graphics engine which in the future became the basis of the engine for Doom. It had no expectations for the reception that the game would receive, but they ended up getting a lot more money than expected, and the game was incredibly well received.
Everyone's dead but me. They can't kill me. Gotta stay smart. They're not gonna win.
Of course, with every violent video game release, there was a lot of talk about how grossly violent the game was, but other than that, the game became a staple in video game history. In September of 1992, Konami released Lethal Enforcers for arcades, the SNES, Sega Genesis, and Sega CD, with a light gun revolver controller called Justifier. The game has you playing as Officer Don Marshall, who has to shoot and kill different groups of criminals in Chicago. Its gameplay is about the same as other rail shooters, but with the Konami Justifier plugged into the console, as you're shooting enemies using the light gun through the course of 6 different stages, getting points for shooting enemies. However, Lethal Enforcers ended up getting under fire for its photorealistic imagery and was one of the 3 video games of the 1993 US Senate hearings on video games. Joe Lieberman, the senator who led this hearing, made a huge deal about the Konami Justifier bundled with Lethal Enforcers and how much it looked like an actual revolver. After the hearing, the game ended up being pulled from Toys R Us and other retail stores that sold video games, along with other controversial titles at the time such as Night Trap and Mortal Kombat. The Sega Genesis version of the game ended up being one of the first video games to receive a mature 17 rating. The game's reception ended up being the top grossing arcade game in late 1992 to early 1993. It received many good reviews, with its graphics being noted as technically impressive, but after the Senate hearings, reviewers felt the game lost its charm when the game was toned down. In 1993, Nintendo with Argonaut Software released Star Fox for the SNES. It is a 3D rail shooter and is the first game in the Star Fox series and follows Fox McCloud and his Star Fox team who are defending their homeworld, Comeria, against the forces of Andross. Designed and produced by Shigeru Miyamoto and programmed by Dylan Cuthbert, Giles Goddard, and Krister Wombell. It is the first ever Nintendo game to use polygonal graphics. Nintendo was told by a programmer, Jez San, that they wanted to have custom hardware to have the Super Nintendo Entertainment System to be better at 3D processing. So San hired designers to make the Super FX chip, and it ended up being much more powerful than the standard SNES's processor. Miyamoto got inspiration from the X-Wings from Star Wars to make the R-Wings. He also wanted the series to have anthropomorphic characters because he didn't want to make stories using typical sci-fi tropes with humans, monsters, and robots. Fox McCloud was inspired by a kitsune, Japanese word for fox, statue at the Fushimi Inari Taisha Shrine. The other characters were inspired by Japanese folklore. Star Fox was an immediate success and sold over 4 million copies and have even compared it to Space Harrier and Afterburner. At the end of 1993, Doom was released on December 10th by id Software for Windows 95. It emerged from the graphics engine that was being developed by John Carmack that I talked about before. He wanted to make a sci-fi game this time inspired by D&D, Aliens, and the Evil Dead movies. After releasing Wolfenstein 3D, id Software wanted to create another 3D game using Carmack's game engine. They considered continuing making games from other franchises that they made, but they decided the engine should have its own concept. The original name for Doom was Green and Pissed, but Carmack renamed it after a line in the movie Color of Money stuck out to him. The main development goal of the game was to have a lot of fast-paced, brutal gameplay much faster than Wolfenstein. They originally had a more arcadey idea for Doom, like having score points and items, as well as a much more complex UI, an inventory, secondary shields, and extra lives, which all ended up being removed. Romero made the maps less boxy and more complex, which everyone else agreed with, as well as the lead designer, Tom Hall, being fired over the fact that he was upset he wasn't having much impact designing the game and fighting with Carmack over with what would actually get into the game. They replaced him with a different designer named Sandy Peterson, who ended up redesigning 20 out of 27 levels. The game, when it was released, ended up crashing the University of Wisconsin-Madison's network when over 10,000 people tried to download the game at the same time. Doom received many high reviews about how it was able to improve from Wolfenstein, praising the visuals, music, gameplay, and how cutting edge it was. Unfortunately, there was a large amount of controversies for Doom, a few of them even being famous. Due to the high amounts of violence and satanic imagery, it was given one of the first mature ratings by the ESRB. It was hated by different religious groups and called a mass murder simulator, and even prompted fear that VR would promote and simulate ultra-realistic killing. Personally, this entire thing is ridiculously ironic because you kill demons in the game, not innocent people. You kill demons. Doom is the ultimate Christian game, but I digress. The biggest controversy that Doom was mentioned in was on April 20th, 1999, where two students named Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris committed one of the biggest school shootings in all of history. The Columbine shooters were big fans of Doom, and in a journal planning the massacre, Eric said that the killing would be a lot like playing Doom, and how his shotgun was straight out of the game. He actually made a couple of custom levels for Doom, however none were based on Columbine High School. Doom ended up becoming one of the most popular and greatest video games in all of video game history. Sega released A/X-101 in 1994 for the Sega Mega CD. The game was set in 2500, where humanity is at its highest point in space travel until contact was made with alien life for the very first time. Earth gets attacked and almost conquered in the war with the Gurzons. The Earth's Defense Force discovers the Gurzons' enemy on the planet Prism and sends 4 of their best pilots, including you, in order to retrieve the computer upgrade System A/X-101 and use it against the Gurzons. The gameplay has you controlling a starfighter that requires you to shoot at enemies flying about using laser cannons and fusion warheads. Laser cannons are unlimited, whilst fusion warheads have a limit of 5 at a time. The reception for this game was pretty low, getting a score of 3 out of 10 on Sega 16, and a reviewer from Mega wrote that it took me longer to write this 400-word review than it did to finish the game. Still in 1994, Virtua Cop was published and developed by Sega as well as being designed and produced by Yu Suzuki. It was released for arcades, the Sega Model 2, then later ported to the Sega Saturn and Windows. You play in first person as Michael Hardy or his partner James Cools. You're required to use a light gun in order to shoot criminals, which allows you to advance throughout the game. A detective who works in your department uncovers an illegal gun running operation and finds the base, gets a lot of evidence, and gets ready to take them down until he is found out and then assassinated. The evidence eventually makes its way back to the department, where you and your partner go out and take down the crime syndicate. The development of this game began for the Sega Saturn in 1995 by a division of Sega AM2. They also used real-time 3D polygon graphics with texture mapping. This game was also the first one to have a mechanic to shoot through glass. After displaying a demo for the game, they started work on the third level, which was the most difficult to make due to the large amount of polygons in the vast area of the office building's ceiling and walls. The reception for this game was extremely positive, being one of America's top 10 best-selling arcade games of 1995, along with selling almost 1 million copies for the Saturn. It ended up being an extremely large influence on shooters and rail shooters to come because of the levels of innovation, that being the visuals, weapon power-ups, non-player characters you're not allowed to kill, and overall gameplay. A year later, Atari Games released Area 51 for arcades, Windows, PlayStation, and the Sega Saturn. Development for this game began in 1994 and was produced as a last-ditch effort due to the fact that Atari has gone 2 years without a profitable game besides World Rally, released in 1993. Atari also had to deal with losing their most talented programmers and developers to Electronic Arts. The original developer they asked to make a light gunner shooter, which was Bounty Hunter, developed by Ed Logg, also left Atari to go work at EA. Atari entrusted development to an external team, being the head of Mesa Logic, Robert Weatherby. Robert found Bounty Hunter to be underwhelming and began work developing on a pitch for a gun game concept. He was inspired by an article in Popular Science called Searching for the Secrets of Groom Lake, which talked about Area 51, hence the name of the game. It uses digitized video footage, and due to the amount of rendering, they had to use a modified Atari Jaguar, or a Kojag, with a hard disk drive, and the lead programmer's custom compression software. In March of 1995, Sega released Panzer Dragoon for the Sega Saturn and was developed by Sega's Team Andromeda. It is also the first game in the series and the first game made by them. The game has 6 levels which last about 5 minutes, with boss battles at the end of each level. The story of the game slowly reveals itself using cutscenes that play before and after the levels. You control a flying dragon and aim for machine and monster enemies in a 3D apocalyptic fantasy world. You go through each level killing different amounts of enemies, using this really cool reticle to shoot laser balls until you reach the final boss at the end of the level, who all have different weak points but all have health bars. If your health bar reaches 0, you die. Pretty straightforward. The story has a lot of lore that has to be explained. If I were to explain it all, it would end up being its own video about the entire series. The development started in the early 90s as the Saturn was preparing to be released. The 23-year-old director of the game, at the time, Yukio Futatsugi, also created Phantom Dust, proposed this game, and was accepted quickly due to the amount of third-party games for the Saturn. Team Andromeda wanted a fully 3D game, like the previous games that they had worked on, like Outrun, along with inspiration from Space Harrier and Star Fox. It became a 3D rail shooter, and Futatsugi wanted a more original idea for the game, so they gave the player an armored dragon. The reason why the game is called Panzer Dragoon is because they translated armored dragon, Kikoryu in Japanese, into German because they wanted it to sound more interesting. They had 3 months to think of visuals and the setting of the game, and decided that the game should be set in a post-apocalyptic sci-fi fantasy world, which would show the ruins of fallen civilizations. This was Futatsugi's first year working at Sega full-time, so he didn't have a lot of control but still had a strong vision, which helped the game's style remain. Keeping with the originality theme, instead of using languages like English or Japanese, Team Andromeda created a new language which was a mix of Slavic languages, Ancient Greek, and Latin. After the story and visuals were finished, they started work on the graphics for the game, but because of the difficulty working on the Saturn's hardware, the team ended up using their own graphics library and mapping tools instead of Sega's provided assets. They were eventually able to transition the game to the Saturn, but it was so hard, it was basically running like Cyberpunk did on the Xbox One on the first day of release. Cyberpunk is actually really good, and you most definitely should play it. It's not a rail shooter, but there is a rail shooter segment in the first 2 hours of the game, and also later on, but I'll elaborate that later on. Anyway, because of the low frame rate, they had to make every level a barren wasteland with ancient ruins scattered about so that the simplicity of the game would be kept with the style that allowed the Saturn to actually run the game. They started work on the soundtrack and made a track for each level to fit the sound of each level. The game was released in Japan on March 10th, 1995, and in America on May 11th the same year, and the reception of Panzer Dragoon was very positive, with the reviews saying that even though the game comes off as a simple shooter, it's a very good one that puts a twist on the tired formula. 3 more games followed this one, and Panzer Dragoon ended up being remade in 2020. This game actually wasn't released for arcades, but was strictly for the Sega Saturn until it was ported to the PC in 1996. There was an unreleased hybrid rail shooter called Varuna's Forces, which was originally projected to be released in 1995. It was in development by Accent Media Productions and planned to be published by Atari for the Atari Jaguar CD, Sega Dreamcast and Saturn, PlayStation, and the 3DO Interactive Multiplayer, and PC. It was supposed to be a sci-fi strategy third-person shooter where the player took control of one of 4 soldiers, and in order to complete missions that varied from hostage rescues, searching and then capturing an enemy base, and several other game modes. Varuna's Forces was announced for the Jaguar CD with teasers at the Atari booth at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show in 1995, along with other games in development. The game was showcased during the very first E3 in 1995. It was announced that the game would come to several consoles, as listed before, as well as showing gameplay footage and previews. Advertisements for the game kept being put out, and the month that it would be released in kept being pushed. Eventually, the 3DO and Jag CD versions were cancelled in 1996 because of the 2 systems being discontinued for poor performance. As they were working on the Saturn version, they were told by the founder of Accent Media Productions, Paul Fullwood, that Sega informed them about an upcoming console, the Dreamcast. The AMP development team then transferred their work for the Dreamcast until they were told that the Dreamcast would be discontinued, causing work for VF to be delayed again. They continued on with the production of the PC version until JVC, who were helping with publication, stumbled upon financial issues which left AMP with no money to complete the game, leaving it unfinished. The game has never been released as it's never even been finished, but after Hasbro released the patents and rights of the Atari Jaguar to the public, it became an open source platform. This also released the unfinished games, including Varuna's Forces, which had 2 non-playable versions of the Jag CD, which was sold and published in 2009. In December of 1995, Namco released Time Crisis, a first-person spy rail shooter series in the future, which required you to shoot all on-screen enemies with a time limit in order to go on to the next level. The game plays in 3 stages with 3 arenas and a boss battle. It is very similar to Virtua Cop with the mechanics of holding a light gun and shooting at on-screen enemies. However, it has a cover system where you can duck in order to avoid enemy fire, and you can use that cover system to reload. However, in order to use this, in arcade versions, you would use a foot pedal to cycle through the ducking and attacking options. Whereas in console versions, you would just press a button. The story of the game was set in 1995, where an international protection agency called the VSSE helps an opposition leader in order to create a coup to overthrow a century-old authoritarian regime. The opposition leader, William McPherson, contacts the VSSE, who recruits Richard Miller to rescue William's daughter, Rachel. Richard goes to the island, creates an entrance for himself via explosives, fights and kills enemies, interrogates the chief assassin, Maz, about where Rachel is, to which Richard then finds Rachel being held at gunpoint by Wild Dog, who reveals his intentions is to blow everything up and escape with Rachel. She breaks free, gets shot, and Richard engages in a fast-paced gun battle until Wild Dog sets off his detonator, falling into his own explosions. Richard picks Rachel up and they escape. Both the arcade and PlayStation versions were developed at Namco, however the arcade dev team had no involvement with the PlayStation version, mostly due to the difference of power, components, and how they were able to cut the frame rate in half by reducing the polygons, real-time lighting by just changing the polygon colors, and limiting the amount of enemies on screen at a time. The reception of Time Crisis was very positive and it was hailed for the foot pedal, ducking mechanic, and reload button on the gun controller that forced players to use both hands. People did have some issues with the game, mainly feeling that it was too simplistic, of course, comparing it to Virtual Cop's avoid shooting innocent NPCs function, as well as not having power-ups. Sega, a year later, released The House of the Dead in September of 1996. It ended up being released a few months after Resident Evil, which was released in March of the same year, and is also credited with the rise of zombie games. The House of the Dead has also been credited with the introduction of fast-running zombies rather than the stereotypical slow ones. It was originally released for arcades, Sega Saturn, and then later ported to the Nintendo Switch, Windows, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Google Stadia. The game's story had you play as Agent Thomas Rogan, where you get a distress call from your fiancée Sophie Richards, where you find out she's at the Curian mansion, where Dr. Curian, a biochemist and geneticist, who slowly became more and more insane as his experiments became much worse. You arrive at the estate with your partner and find that it is overrun with Dr. Curian's experiments, that being zombies. You kill zombies until you reach Sophie, where she is carried by a giant creature called the Hanged Man. You find her again, where she gets attacked by the Chariot, who is heavily armored. After killing him, you attend to her wounds before she passes out, and she tells you to stop Curian, otherwise something bad will happen. You kill more zombies until you eventually reach Curian, who is protected by the Hermit, and after killing it, you have to battle Curian's masterpiece, that being the Magician. However, the Magician refuses to serve any master, and attacks you, prompting a final boss fight. After killing the Magician, it explodes and Thomas and his partner leave the mansion. Now the cool thing about this game is that it has 3 different endings that all depend on how many points you've gotten. The bad ending basically has Sophie turning into a zombie, the neutral ending is a far view of the mansion, unknown if Sophie is actually alive or not, and the true ending is where Sophie is alive and healthy and says thank you to the player. The development for this game began in 1995 and took 15 months to complete. The development team didn't know how to speak English, but they took different Japanese horror-themed phrases and picked the ones that had the coolest visuals whenever translated. The game was built on the Virtual Cop engine, and the devs wanted a much more complicated effect that the different endings/routes would have, but they didn't have enough time to do this. They had to make changes to the blood and gore in the game for other countries, mainly Germany, by allowing arcade operators to change the color of the blood to either blue, purple, or green. There were also 2 cabinet formats for the House of the Dead, with 2 different screen sizes being a 29-inch screen and a 50-inch screen. The reception for this game was extremely positive, with NGamer giving the game a 4 out of 5 stars. However, despite the good reviews, the game received quite an amount of controversy. In 2000, Indianapolis attempted to ban violent video games and argued that the House of the Dead was obscene, but then the judge reviewed the game and found that the ban was unconstitutional because of the cartoon-like depictions of violence. Star Fox 64 was then released in April of 1997 by Nintendo and has been deemed one of the greatest video games of all time. The game mostly takes place in corridor mode, which has you in Fox's vehicle down an on-rails path. In this mode, you're able to maneuver around the screen to dodge obstacles and projectiles. And of course, you're able to do a barrel roll! This game also gives you a few different vehicles, such as the standard R-Wing, a Landmaster, which is like a tank, and a submarine called the Blue Marine. It features the same characters from the first game. After the release of the first Star Fox game, Shigeru Miyamoto began development on Star Fox 2 for the SNES, and they had a lot completed until they realized that they would need the upgraded Super FX2 chip, which would make the game much more expensive, as well as newer, more powerful consoles being released that made the SNES essentially obsolete, that being the PlayStation and Sega Saturn, which rendered Star Fox 2 also obsolete. So Miyamoto cancelled Star Fox 2 in order to make a different Star Fox game for a brand new console about to be released, the Nintendo 64. After the cancellation, they began work on Star Fox 64, which used about 30% of the original game, 60% from the cancelled second game, and 10% original work. Most of the game modes also came from the cancelled game. However, the newer vehicles were added to the request of Miyamoto's wishes for an inclusion of a human-type craft, which the team didn't fully approve of. They actually wanted to have more underwater levels, but they decided against it for the reason that underwater levels would have slowed the game's pace. With the gameplay being mostly complete, they decided to work on some of the smaller details, like the music, visuals, audio, and AI. Miyamoto, inspired by Thunderbirds, used the opening and closing of the mouths for characters while speaking to reduce animation work. It was also the first game to use the Rumble Pack, which would be added to the Nintendo 64 controller to make it vibrate for immersion and gameplay purposes. The reception was extremely positive, getting scores of 8s and 9s out of 10, and is considered one of the greatest video games ever made. Namco published the sequel to Time Crisis 2. It is very similar to the previous game, but with the inclusion of 2 players being able to play at the same time. It has a different story focusing on 2 different agents, and the gameplay uses a new mechanic called Crisis Flash, which essentially notifies the player if the enemy's attack would cause a direct hit. Other than the fact that some sections gave you a machine gun with unlimited ammo, not much has changed from the first game. In 1998, The House of the Dead 2 was released by Sega, which is similar to the first but with a few new mechanics and a continuation of the story. You're able to point off screen that auto-reloads you without having you pull the trigger. It also features different endings with the conditions of whether you played the game alone or with someone else. If both players were alive and defeated the final boss, how many times the player/players died, and how many points were earned. The game has you play as James Taylor and Gary Stewart, where you investigate Venice, where Dr. Curion's lab was located. They encounter zombies and G from the previous game, where he's wounded in a library. G gives them a journal that shows them the bosses and their weak points. We're then met with a horde of zombies. After defeating more zombies and a boss named Quarrel, you learn that the zombies were created by Caleb Goldman, who financed Curion's creations. It's also revealed that he created and released new zombies out into the city. He then calls one of your partners and invites to meet with them at the Coliseum. After splitting up in a few boss fights, you eventually get to the Coliseum, where you discover 2 of your partners injured and a giant chainsaw-wielding zombie called Strength. After killing it and tending to wounds, they drive over to Goldman's Tower, where you fight revived bosses from the previous game. Once they reach the core, they encounter the Magician, who was revived by Goldman for the reason to oversee the birth of the Emperor, which is a shape-shifting crystalline entity. After killing the Magician, they head to the top of the tower and encounter the Emperor, where it gets killed by the agents and Goldman jumps off of his building to avoid getting arrested. There are once again 3 different endings, where the good ending has Gary and James running into Thomas from the first game, who tells them that G and their partners are alright. The normal ending has Gary and James leaving the building, being greeted by their partners and healthy civilians thanking them for their help. In the bad ending, they both run into zombie Goldman and a gunshot is heard as the screen goes white. It was positively received and praised for the level design, however a lot of the reviewers said that the quality of the voice acting is extremely poor. In 1999, Konami released Silent Scope for arcades, the PS2, the Dreamcast, and the Game Boy Advance, which puts you in the shoes of a sniper during terrorist scenarios. The gameplay has you using a mounted rifle on the console in order to shoot at enemies by scoping and then shooting them. There's also an Easter egg where you can locate an attractive woman who gives you extra health and points if you scope at her. You have to shoot at specific enemies in a short amount of time whilst facing lesser bosses, and eventually at the end, there's a large boss that you have to kill. Headshots of course do the most damage and give the most points. It was received with mixed reviews, with people wanting more realistic missions and how the audio mixing is not very well done, as well as the voice acting being horrendous on top of that. The House of the Dead 3 was released in 2002 and has the same director as the previous 2 games, however the developer is different. Sega still owned and published the game, but the developers were WoW Entertainment instead of Sega AM1 and Forever Entertainment. The game's story is set in 2019 and follows the disappearance of Agent Tom Rogan in the EFI research facility along with his daughter Lisa and G on an adventure to find him. This game has 4 endings depending on how many credits you had to put in during the game. Depending on which location you went to last and what your rank is at the end of the game, it alters each ending. Receiving a lower ranking will give you the ending where G, Lisa, Thomas, and Daniel leave the facility, to which Daniel says that his father's work will not go to waste if humans go down the wrong path. This ending is the true ending. The second ending has all 4 of them leaving the facility, but instead Daniel transforms into a zombie. The third ending has Daniel and Lisa discovering that G's van was stolen by a zombie and Lisa chases after it. The fourth ending has a man in a business suit entering the lab where he picks up one of Curion's vials, saying that Curion didn't understand its true purpose. The gameplay is entirely different from the previous games, giving the player shotguns instead of pistols. In order to reload, in the arcade version, the player has to pump the shotgun controller. The branching story paths are similar to the previous games, however here, depending on which area you choose to go to first, it will grant you a different ending. There are also no civilians, but instead rescue events where you need to rescue your partners from attacking zombies, and completing one successfully grants you an extra life. Players can also have more lives, and anything more than 9 lives gives you bonus points. Early development of the game had cell shading, which would have made the game look more cartoonish, but was abandoned in order to keep consistency with the series. The reception received was fairly mixed, but with more positive reviews praising the ability to kill multiple enemies, better visuals, and more endings. A few months later, Time Crisis 3 was released for arcades and the PS2. Namco published it, but unlike the previous 2 games, they did in development. A different company called Nextech did. The game takes place 6 years after the second Time Crisis and requires you to go through several missions in order to stop an organization called the LLF and the Zagorian Federation from the previous games from blowing up nearby nations with ballistic missiles, as well as liberating an island nation. The gameplay refines a lot of past mechanics and visuals and added use of multiple weapons. You can have a 9-round handgun, an automatic machine gun, a shotgun, and a grenade launcher with lethal splash damage. The handgun, however, is the only gun with unlimited ammo. The game also notifies you more effectively when there will be a life-threatening shot by making the screen much brighter, and still uses the pedal system from before. Time Crisis 3 received many positive reviews. Now at this point I have talked and shown a lot of rail shooters and other first-person shooters. The reason why I include FPS shooters rather than rail shooters is because they're a really good indicator as to what exactly caused the later descent of rail shooters in the coming years, as well as a really good indicator of how much more complex these type of games would become. Mainly after PC and console gaming were becoming much more affordable and consumer-friendly, like the release of the Xbox 360 in 2005 and the PlayStation 3 in 2006. Gaming from home was much easier, and especially with much more stimulating and complex first-person shooters being released, such as the Halo franchise, Half-Life 2, Deus Ex, and the Call of Duty franchise. Actual rail shooter releases, besides of course the Time Crisis and House of the Dead franchises, were either strictly released for arcades or weren't as prominently popular as console/PC games. In 2006, The House of the Dead 4 was released worldwide and was developed by WoW Entertainment and published by Sega. The strange thing about this game is that it's technically a sequel to House of the Dead 2 because the 4th game is set 3 years after the 2nd, whereas House of the Dead 3 is set 13 years after the 4th game. I don't know why anyone would do this. There are 4 endings in the 4th game, fitting. And with the common theme in this game series, it depends on what you do during the game. Every ending also has a screen that shows, "The story continues in The House of the Dead 3. 3 years after the Goldman case, a new agent, James Taylor, along with a new agent, Kate Green, gather intelligence in the basement of the AMS headquarters. James remembers the Goldman case and is convinced that the events of it are not done. They then get trapped in the basement due to an earthquake, and they wait for a rescue team for a few days. James's handheld PC goes off, and they see zombies on the cameras, so they get weapons and travel through sewers to an information room where they find out that nuclear missiles are going to be fired around the world in 24 hours, and face against a pair of mutated tarantulas and a giant 4-armed zombie. They go through other zombies and avoid other tarot card zombie themed names, and eventually stumble on the surface, and James gets sent a message by Goldman saying that the missiles will be fired in 1 hour. They head towards his abandoned building and defeat a levitating thing, and they arrive in time to stop the launch. However, Goldman reveals that he wants to revert mankind to its original state so that the planet could stop being harmed by humans. Oh yeah, and then zombie mutated thing gets killed by James, who sacrifices himself by having his handheld PC self-destruct, and Kate walks out of the premises distraught. The 4 endings in this game are fairly unique. The standard ending has a shot of Goldman's computer with him in a video saying that the human race has not been eliminated, and he leaves the room. The bad ending has the same ending, but Goldman turns into a zombie. The G ending has G appearing outside of Goldman's building and says that the zombie crisis is not over and tells James to rest in peace. The last ending is the Mystery Man ending, which has an unnamed man who was seen in one of the endings in the 3rd game. The mysterious man sits in his study and says that Goldman is too soft and that humans do not deserve hope before saying that the true end will soon begin. There is also something called the House of the Dead 4 Special, where it takes place shortly after the non-special House of the Dead 4, and in the PS3 port you can unlock this after completing the original game. Kate wanders the city alone and acts on her promise to James in order to keep fighting and never give up. She then encounters G, who says the battle isn't over. They then go out and fight an infestation of entities, tracing them to their source. They drive to a building and fight the revived four-armed zombie called Justice, and when they get to the core of the secret lab, they discover the magician, reawakened, who seeks revenge. The magician gets defeated, but he tries to open Pandora's box, which shows up before him. There are two endings here based on a QuickTime event where you have to throw a grenade in order to destroy the box. The bad ending has Magician activating multiple clones of itself, and the words "bad end" fade onto the screen. The good ending has you destroying the box and Magician explodes, and has G telling Kate that the fight is about to begin. There is also a bonus ending which has the mysterious man limping to where Magician exploded, saying, "So Pandora's box has been closed. The wheel of fate cannot be stopped." The gameplay has two players enter a room with a ride vehicle inside with a sound system. The vehicle is able to spin 360 degrees, shakes when enemies attack, and shoots the player with air whenever they take damage. It has two light guns and an action button. This game is the first arcade light gunner to have an HD widescreen display. The game runs in 1080 interlaced on both the Deluxe and Super Deluxe cabinets, whilst the standard cabinet has a 480 interlaced screen. However, because of how intricate these arcade machines were, they slowly were discontinued due to constant breakdowns. The reception for these games were fairly positive, with IGN saying that it was the most visually impressive arcade game ever made, with other reviews praising the gameplay, improved light guns, details with enemies, and the overall game world. In the early summer of the same year, Time Crisis was released for arcades by Next Entertainment and published by Namco. The gameplay is essentially the same as before, with the pedals, light guns. However, this time it featured a first-person shooter mode, only for the PS3, as well as a multi-hiding system. The development for the fourth game was first shown at the 2006 E3. There was also another Time Crisis released in 2001 called Time Crisis Project Titan, and originally had the multi-hiding system and allowed for the reload to just have the player point the gun away from the screen due to a new emitter put into the light gun. The light gun now uses infrared emitters rather than the cathode ray timing that was used for all the previous Namco branded light gun games. These had about the same accuracy but were much more efficient, along with allowing you to customize the gun's calibration. There were also two cabinets made for the game, the standard 29-inch and the deluxe 52-inch cabinets. It was also released for the PS3, much later with a light gun controller. The game received mixed reviews with criticisms for its plot, first-person shooter mode, and shooting mechanics. There was also a review that said that the gun controller feels cheap and does not have an ambidextrous design. A week later, Sega released Let's Go Jungle, Lost on the Island of Spice, as a strict arcade release. It was a fixed light gun rail shooter where you control one or two characters, Ben and Nora, that being what a Wikipedia editor describes as a dysfunctional couple. Oh, actually their relationship is bad, never mind then. You follow them around while they're going around on an island tour to make their relationship better, but they find out that there are giant bugs, insects, arachnids, and other animals under violent tendencies. There is a boss at the end of each of the three stages that the game gives you, that being the cave, the river, and an abandoned village. Each stage has different types of enemies, boss, and QuickTime events. There were two cabinets made for this game, the first being the upright double-fixed gun cabinet, and the deluxe 55-inch enclosed cabinet that looks like a Jeep. The game got a fairly positive response, and it was enough of a response to give the game a sequel. 2 years later, a game for the Xbox called Aces of the Galaxy was published by Sierra Online and was developed by Artec Studios. In the game, you take control of a spaceship in order to kill waves of enemies. There isn't really much to the game from what I could find besides, "Control the fastest guns in space in Aces of the Galaxy," trademark. "The non-stop old-school arcade space shooter for the 21st century." It also appears to be a get points rail shooter. According to Fandom, it was given an 8.4 out of 10 by IGN, saying that Aces of the Galaxy is a solid, well-balanced space shooter. In 2010, Raw Thrills published Terminator Salvation for arcades. It was developed by Play Mechanics and is a light gun rail shooter. It is also an adaptation of the movie of the same name. The player plays as John Connor during the war against Skynet's machines. There are 2 missions in the game with 4 chapters. The first is to seek and destroy Skynet's secret lab, where they experiment on humans, and the second has you escorting refugees to a safe house and then destroy Skynet. The gameplay has you using a customized M4A1 with 60 bullets. In order to reload, you smack the bottom of the magazine, and the button on the front side of the gun is used to throw grenades. You go through an armada of enemies in Terminator Salvation, with the main ones being the T-600s, T-600 infiltrators, and the 2 bosses being the Harvester and the HK-tank. There are 4 different versions of the arcade cabinets, that being the 32-inch and 42-inch fixed gun cabinets, the 42-inch deluxe cabinet, which was at Funhaven that I went to, non-functioning, unfortunately, and the super deluxe 100-inch projected screen cabinet with 2 Terminator torsos instead of just 1 on top of the machine. There aren't many reviews for the game besides a few arcade websites praising the gameplay, story, and mechanics. However, they aren't too keen on the graphics of the game. In May of the same year, Namco released Dead Storm Pirates, which is a pirate-themed light gun rail shooter arcade game. I ran into issues looking for the actual release date, as websites say that it was released in 2009, and others say it was released in different months in 2010. However, I found an official Namco manual that says its first edition was published in May 2010, so this will be my gauge of when it was released. The player controls 2 members of a pirate crew, being Eric and Leah. You're required to shoot and kill through different supernatural creatures, entities, and monsters with your unlimited golden guns for treasure, that being the Poseidon's Breath. The golden guns are fixed light guns, and you have a wheel in the center that you are able to turn for in-game events when it is required. There are 5 different game areas that you can go to, that being the Stormy Sea, Mountain Valley, Cave, Great Whirlpool, and Treasure. The Stormy Sea has you fighting undead pirate skeletons and different creatures to a similar caliber. You must also use the wheel in order to steer your ship towards other enemy ships. Mountain Valley has you shooting piranhas, bats, and a giant rock, and you are required to use the wheel in order to steer into safety while going down the fast-flowing river. Cave is more pirate skeletons, bats, and then eventually a giant snake, and you need to use the wheel to avoid crashing while in a minecart. The Great Whirlpool has you spending your time shooting and avoiding a giant kraken who is destroying your ship at the same time as using the wheel to steer away from debris and the whirlpool. Finally, the Treasure has you fighting even more pirate skeletons and wraiths while you use the wheel to aim a giant crossbow. Over the course of these levels, you are given an opportunity to shoot 3 chests with differing and randomly selected prizes, like more health and similar things like that. There is also a mechanic where, if you're playing with another person, you can combine your shots together for an even more powerful combination shot. The fixed gun also vibrates during some parts of the game and just stops shooting entirely whenever the game forces you to use the wheel. This game had 2 cabinets, that being a stand-up version and the more common closed booth deluxe version, which features a 54-inch monitor, surround sound, and rumble seats. There were also special versions of the game called Dead Storm Pirates 3D, and a 4-player version, Dead Storm Pirates 4D+. There was also another version of this game that was released in 2014 called Dead Storm Pirates Special Edition, which added 2 new missions. The reviews for this game praise the arcade experience, the fact that it's memorable, and is fairly challenging. However, this website also says that the wheel action scenarios truly suck ass, which honestly I would have to agree with, since the rock in this section hit me when I was spinning it in the proper direction. In mid-2011, Sega released the sequel to Let's Go Island called Let's Go Island Lost on the Island of Tropics, which didn't have many changes besides the story, characters, color scheme, and enemies. Instead of Ben and Nora, you play as 2 new characters whose tour boat crashes into a pirate's boat and they end up getting chased by sharks after falling into the sea. They fight the sharks and the game goes on in similar island areas, fighting against pirates as well as enemies similar to the previous game. The gameplay hasn't changed much besides the visuals and slightly better mechanics. There were 2 cabinets made for the game, one being the standard upright version, and a second partially enclosed deluxe cabinet with a shark head on the back of it. There is very little info about this game, but judging that there weren't any more sequels for the Let's Go Island series, I'm going to assume that the sale performance for this game was less than the first. 2 years later, Sega released another fixed light gun rail shooter called Transformers Human Alliance for arcades. It is set in the Transformers franchise and was actually the first Transformers arcade video game. The gameplay had you using the fixed light gun turret and shooting at enemies in a green or red outline. Depending on what outline, it indicates whether the attack is going to be avoidable or not. There are 4 stages that all end with a boss fight against different Decepticons. The first stage is in East America, where you face off a lot of Decepticons, with Bumblebee, and saving different characters along the way and escaping from Starscream. Stage 2 is sectioned into 2 parts, Stage 2A and Stage 2B. Near Automata reference. 2A is set in England Central City and has you investigating the epicenter of an earthquake until an organization called Nest gets ambushed and you're required to shoot drones and kill a Decepticon. 2B is set in North Africa desert with 2 characters, Vanessa and Jake, going with Optimus Prime to follow the source of the earthquakes and end up walking into an ambush. They fight off different insects and eventually fight Scorponic King. Stage 3 is set in USA West Coast and has the Decepticons launching an assault on an unnamed West Coast city. Stage 4 is set in the Canadian frontier and Bumblebee, Vanessa, and Jake crash land somewhere in Canada following Optimus's signal, but instead find Megatron. They fight Megatron, and before they're able to finish him off, another earthquake occurs with Vanessa noting that the Energon Tower has gone out of control and that its power will destroy the world. Everyone destroys the tower and Megatron escapes. There were 2 cabinets made for Human Alliance, that being the standard 42-inch cabinet and a theater version with a 55-inch screen. The reception for the game isn't documented, however it was said on the Transformers wiki that the voice lines were really cheesy, along with Destructoid saying that it looks fun and that it doesn't have any reason not to do well. In the same year of 2013, Triotech released an interactive experience called the XD Dark Ride, a multi-sensory light gun rail shooter with 11 game selections. Triotech calls them movies. That being Alien Asteroid, Carnival, Forbidden Mine, Gigamon, Los Banditos, Neon Ninja, Pirates, Road Fighters, Robot Riot, Werewolves, and Zombies, which I have played. Each movie has its very own experience, most of them being horror themed. However, they all have the same mechanics. Point the light gun at enemies, pull the trigger, and get points. Each experience features a training tutorial, which is basically an ultra-budget version of Aim Labs in order for you to get the hang of the shooting mechanics. There are currently more than 200 installations of this around the world and even has seats for 4 players up to 40 and even got an IAAPA Brass Ring Award for Best New Product. Dark Ride also has fans that blow into your face, 3D glasses you're meant to wear, rumble seats, speakers built into the headrest of the seat, and a camera that takes pictures of you in the heat of the moment. It is pretty cool, but in retrospect, it's just another rail shooter idea that can only be sold at arcades and ends up becoming old once you've seen all the quote-unquote movies because they all follow the same formula. In March of 2015, Raw Thrills developed another rail shooter called Jurassic Park Arcade. The gameplay consists of fixed light guns while shooting at different dinosaurs. You are also able to lose points if you shoot friendly NPCs, but they end up dying anyway, so it doesn't entirely matter unless you're going for points. There are 3 sections in the game, but 9 total stages, with 3 boss enemies being the Spinosaurus, Triceratops, and the Tyrannosaurus, along with killing smaller dinosaurs. Honestly, there isn't that much of a story besides shoot and kill bad dinosaurs and watch your coworkers slowly get killed off over time. The development started in 2011 and costed Raw Thrills $4 million to develop in the 3 years that it took. The devs studied the Jurassic Park games from the past along with notable scenes in the movies. They set the game on Isla Nublar, where the first game was based in, and unlike the movie where the dinosaurs were escaping, the devs wanted to have a story where the player must capture the dinosaurs which were roaming the island freely. There was a lot of cut content, and Nate Vanderkamp, who is the game's lead artist and designer, stated, "I'm pretty sure that by the end we had more cut ideas than actually made into the game." The cut content included a water section, a level in a city, and way more boss enemies. The developers have also never designed a shooter before and were working with new software and a new game engine. Luckily, the game ended up being completed and was shown at the UK EAG Expo in January of 2015. There were 2 cabinets released for the game, a regular sit-down cabinet and a deluxe Tycon cabinet. Reviews for the game were positive, averting expectations and being impressed by the pacing of the game. A year later, on the 13th of October, Sony published Until Dawn: Rush of Blood for the PlayStation 4. The game was developed by Supermassive Games, who also developed the previous game a year prior. It's Until Dawn if you couldn't guess. Rush of Blood is a spin-off and has the player in a roller coaster going through a horror carnival amusement park that gets more and more insane as the game goes on. The game features 7 different roller coasters / levels, which includes the locations and characters from the non-spin-off. You are given a default handgun, however you are able to get other weapons throughout the course of the game. The plot of the game is actually pretty interesting, with a supportive and cheery guy named Dan T. The T stands for tutorial. He tells you how to handle the levels, but before you're about to finish the first level, a psycho appears and switches the tracks, which causes you to end up in a lodge where the psycho attacks you, along with smaller enemies. Right as you're about to escape, you get knocked out by the psycho. Dan then tells you that the gas will cause you to hallucinate, and at the end of the second level, the psycho quote-unquote eats you until you confront him and kill him in an explosion. Dan then slowly goes through the same effect as Purple Guy does in Five Nights at Freddy's sister location, and you kill a giant spider, escape from Wendigos from the original game, sadly no Kona's Wendigos, and you end up in a cavern where you find Dan, who is now a cannibalistic beast. You avoid his attacks until you send him falling down a lava pit, but he grabs you and takes you with him. Whenever you finish each level, you are shown Dan getting taken care of in a hospital until finishing the last level, in which Dan says the procedure needs to be tried a few more times. If you complete this game on the hardest difficulty, Psychotic, a scene from the original gameplay is where 2 people are eating a corpse. It is then shown that you are actually Josh from Until Dawn and that the game is taking place in his mind. After the initial release of Until Dawn, Rush of Blood was rumored to be in development until it was fully announced as a title for the PlayStation VR in November of 2015. The game ended up getting mixed reviews with positive comments about the atmosphere, but critics had issues with the length of the game and how repetitive it was. In 2018, Sega of China released another Transformers game, the sequel to Transformers: Human Alliance, Transformers: Shadows Rising. It was developed by Sega and is also based on the Transformers series. Shadows Rising is basically the same gameplay-wise compared to Human Alliance, however the story is different and includes an achievement system. There are 4 stages like the first game, with the first stage being in the Pacific Ocean and has Optimus Prime, Bumblebee, Sideswipe, Vanessa, Jake, and Nest soldiers headed to the Pacific Ocean to infiltrate a secret base under the sea. They battle through Decepticons and Decepticon drones until they find the base. Once they go in it, Vanessa and Jake get dragged through corridors by an unnamed Decepticon. After escaping that, they get an energy signal in the second stage, Whales. They go to find the source and get attacked by more Decepticons. Once they reach the source, they get ambushed by Grimlock, who was being controlled by a device on his neck. The device gets destroyed and Grimlock recovers from what happens to him. Stage 3 is set in East China and you have to liberate KSI HQ because the Decepticons took it over for themselves. Once you reach the headquarters, you're ambushed by a Decepticon drone and you kill him and other Decepticons in the area. After they get to the ground, they destroy another drone and access its memories and find out that there is a huge ship flying to the moon with the missing workers trapped as hostages in there. The final stage is called the Moon and has you flying to the moon, of course, killing Decepticons and a clone of Optimus Prime who you kill as well. And then Optimus and Megatron fight, and Megatron gets launched into space before screaming that he will be reborn. The group gets into an escape pod and they go back to Earth. This game included 2 arcade cabinets, one being a standard fixed gun cabinet and the main one being sold as a theater cabinet with a 55-inch HD screen. The reviews for the game were much more positive than the first, praising the gameplay and how pretty the cabinet looks. In the late few months of the same year, Sega, again, released House of the Dead's Scarlet Dawn. It was released in Japan for location testing in September and in the US a month later and developed by Sega Interactive using Unreal Engine 4. The gameplay is similar to the previous games but with a different scoring system, with the ranks being based on 5 categories: score, amount of enemies killed, critical shots, events, and accuracy. There are also many differences between the Japanese version of the game and the North American version. The story is set 3 years after the 4th game, in 2006, and you can see Kate joining with Ryan Taylor, the brother of her late husband and mentor. They go on an undercover mission during a dinner event in Scarecrow Manor, and the manager, Thornheart, unleashes his own mutated creatures in the manor. Kate and Ryan then progress through the mansion in order to stop him. You fight through zombies, giant mutants, resurrected Curian creatures, Chariot, Hangman, and Thornheart's masterpiece being the Moon, who is the final boss battle. Once the Moon is dead, Kate and Ryan wake up the next day and recall James's motto, never to lose hope. Like the previous games, there are 4 endings, each depending on where you select to start in. However, there are no zombie endings. The first ending has Thornheart alive and unharmed walking alongside rows of incubation tanks. The second ending is in the church, and Thornheart states that the ordeal has only just begun and the camera glitches out. The third ending has Thornheart leaving the church from his chair and says that it's impossible to change a predefined future. The last and best ending has Ryan telling Kate that he's tired of people close to him being victimized, and Kate reminds him of what James would say, and they leave. The development for the 5th game started in 2012, but Sega AM1 faced technical issues along with budget issues. They had a hard time looking for something to make the arcade cabinet really stand out. Eventually, the project was scrapped despite the enemies and the prologue of the game being completed. They then started development on Scarlet Dawn in 2018, feeling that arcades have really advanced in their technology. Originally, Takashi Oda wanted to have a mechanism that would hit the cabinet whenever something would attack the player, but then realized that the rumble seats provided the same effect. The game was released but was met with mixed reviews and with constant comparisons to the 4th game in the series. The Super Deluxe arcade cabinet had an HD 55-inch screen, 5-dimensional experience, and was a 3D molded interactive cabinet. Oda has claimed that he wants to develop 3 more House of the Dead games, but with more freedom with movement, and would even develop an FPS title if the demand is high enough. In 2020, Megapixel Studio developed a remake for Panzer Dragoon, fittingly called Panzer Dragoon Remake. It was published by Forever Entertainment and released on Steam on September 25th. The gameplay is mostly the same as the original Saturn version, but with overhauled visuals, music, no option to customize / bind the controls to your liking, and sadly no Fudetsugi. The story is the same as before, however if you adjust the volume of the music and the sound effects, it does nothing for the actual cutscenes, which ended up blasting my ears whenever I press new game. The reviews for this game weren't as good as expected and were given mostly mediocre and mixed reviews. Game Skinny gave it a 7 out of 10 and said that it was very nostalgic, short, and intentionally unforgiving. With this game being available on Steam, it sells for $30, which is the amount you can spend on a adorable cat game, and it is much better to get this game when it's on sale for less than $10, or when I got it for $3 during the production of this video. It is not worth $30. That is absurd. Now, there has been an obvious decline when it came to the production of actual grounded rail shooters to the definition of the genre. Due to how much video games have just progressed over the last 20 to 30 years, video game companies and gamers decided that they would like to have more freedom of movement in games and allow for the player to be able to accomplish things in the game besides just sitting, moving, pointing, and then clicking with the repetitive nature of rail shooters. Now, are rail shooters bad? No, far from it, but they are outdated. The overall future for the genre isn't looking too bright, but rail shooters have most definitely impacted the way that video games are like today. Of course, one of the main reasons for the decline is in the fact that the formula for it is something that you can only give a new coat of paint so many times before every game I talked about before just ends up being the same thing over and over, but with slightly different visuals and allowing you to have more control over the casual course of time. Because of this, it appears that rail shooters have slowly gone out of fashion, and that they might not last too much longer. They are still being produced, but they're not as popular as they were in the past, especially with game releases nowadays like Cyberpunk 2077, Stray, and Ready or Not. All of these games, compared to rail shooters, have a lot more that they are able to offer, such as open world, turning, actual movement, better visuals, bigger budget, not limited to arcades, most of them, fatter stories, dialogue options, NPC interactions, and just so much more. Of course, when it comes to talking about the game genres, however, they're all different in their own ways. And the point that I'm making is the fact that rail shooters are ridiculously limited, and even people developing games for the genre knew this. Sega with Space Harrier wanted to make a brand new looking game, and in turn ended up reinventing the look of arcades with the Tycon cabinets and the Continue screen. After several years, they released Virtua Cop, which changed the genre officially by allowing real-life movement by using the pedal function to duck. This was the same case with Time Crisis, but with slightly cleaner mechanics with the pedals. The House of the Dead really modified the genre by giving the player different endings for the game, which was really revolutionary at the time. Over the course of PC and console games getting better, arcade games slowly started declining in quality and would strictly stay in arcades. Adding on to that, the equipment used inside of most arcade cabinet machines haven't been able to improve too much, and basically have the same specs as a modified Xbox One or a slightly worse PlayStation 3, but I digress. Due to the specs and decline of classic arcade games, besides going there and have a slightly nostalgic craving to play these games rather than playing the games that would get you tickets so that you can buy really low quality prizes and candy, there haven't been many releases in the rail shooter world due to this. Instead, there are just giant versions of games like Giant Pac-Man, Giant Space Invaders, and other giant games you can play with friends. Or you can play multiplayer games on Discord until 3 AM and screaming about how you not getting an ace in Valorant is due to the fact that your internet is really bad. But yeah, you can play giant games in arcades, and rail shooters are declining rapidly. However, this isn't entirely true. Now, the strict genre definition of rail shooters are in fact at a decline, but most AAA games and newer video games do actually include rail shooter segments in the game. In Cyberpunk, the car chase sequences has the NPC character driving the car whilst you're out of the car window and shooting at enemies with a pistol. Make sure you hit those crits. Something that surprised me actually was a demo/game called The Matrix Awakens, an Unreal Engine 5 experience released on December 9th, 2021 by Unreal Engine, showcasing their newest game engine, Unreal Engine 5. Now, the majority of this is a demo with Unreal, showing off their new game engine and how far we've come with video game production. However, I have one big issue with this demo. The Matrix is a series that is supposed to free your mind and is huge on individuality and personal control, but the combat sequence is a rail shooter that forces you to shoot the tires. This demo is really cool, don't get me wrong. I just find it amusing that they use one of the oldest video game genres/gimmicks to showcase the newest video game technology. Just a little bit ironic. Of course, this is only during the showcase part of the demo, and after the entire gameplay/cutscene sections are able to walk around the world and drive around. But that still applies to my previous statement how video games are still using the rail shooter format, but with it being integrated into the entire game regardless of what genre you're playing. All in all, the rail shooter video game genre is one of the oldest and most revolutionary video game formats ever created. Starting humbly at the rise of light gun games almost 100 years ago, all of arcade history, the growth and evolution of the genre, the diverse range of games, and most of all, the nostalgia that it gives people whenever they go to an arcade and see the giant arcade cabinet sitting there waiting for someone to put in their credits and press start on the fixed gun controller. Even though rail shooters are declining in popularity and practically dying besides remasters of Panzer Dragoon, there is no doubt that video games would be the way that they are today without everything that they have ever given us ever since the birth of the genre in the 1970s. The underrated elements of the genre are some of the most important in all of video game history. So the next time you go to an arcade and see Dead Storm Pirates, a really janky Jurassic Park game, or just any rail shooter, give it a chance. Try to get the highest score, or you can experience the jank all by yourself, or with friends and family. This was the evolution, timeline, growth, and overall history of rail shooters. Something I want to make a note of. While doing research for this video, there were a lot of games with extremely interesting stories, and I decided that the games with the more interesting developmental stories would get more time me talking about than games that didn't have the same value. The gameplay being more interesting to me would be getting more time talked about, the story of the game would be getting more talked about if I was interested, and so on with similar examples. Especially with game series that were being released over the course of 5 to 10 to 20 years, like Time Crisis and House of the Dead. Time Crisis had a pretty generic spy story where just the spy goes into thing to rescue/reclaim person or object type story, whereas House of the Dead had an actually interesting story tied along with it. Time Crisis also didn't do that much with the story, whereas House of the Dead straight up had a mechanic where depending on what you do, it would change the ending of the game. That is just super cool. Like, that is in the that was in The Witcher 3, that was just in Cyberpunk, that's in every single game that has like story elements, and the fact that it was like back then with what you did in the game, that's super cool. Especially with how some of the games now only have like 3 endings or so. House of the Dead had 4 at the time. It was a technological marvel. But yeah, this was the history of rail shooters. I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I would really like to thank Spec for the pictures of Let's Go Jungle and showing me the existence of that game, Foxes 2 for the keygen music, and people who provided music and visuals. Your stuff will be down in the description. I would once again really appreciate you all liking, subscribing, commenting your thoughts in the comments section, checking out the links in the description, sharing and checking out my other videos on my channel, and thank you all for watching, and I hope you all have a day.